Ladies and gentlemen, if we could please take our seats. Ladies and gentlemen, I'd like to welcome our third panel, Making Every Main Street Investable, and our moderator, AEO's very own Tammy Halevi, Senior Vice President for New Initiatives, and our panelists, Ira Lieberman, the Founding Executive Director of CGAP at the World Bank and President of Lippom International, Paul Pride, Principal, Capital Access Group, Joel Hornstein, Managing Director, Dream Fund, and Brad Heritage, Vice President, Funding Circle.
So we heard about the power of big data and technology and how we can move from decline to delight. Now we're going to talk about the capital piece of the puzzle, making main streets investable in every community. We have 4 terrific panelists with me on stage. Each of them will share a big idea about moving money to Main Street. We're going to hear from each of them and then open it up to you all for questions and conversation. So, Ira, let's start with you.
Thank you, Tammy. I want to take 1 minute to just thank AEO, Connie, and Tammy, above all, for partnering with us all the way in this and guiding us. We certainly could not have done this study without their support. I'd also like to thank Calmetto Foundation, who augmented the budget for this. And above all, my team. I've gotten a lot of credit personally, and I thank Connie and others for that. But I've had a terrific team. You heard Keith Catanzano chaired 1 panel today. Paul DeLeo is also with us. And I had a team of 6 professionals that worked all the way through with great dedication. And finally, I'd like to thank all of you out there who are willing to be interviewed in person, give us a lot of information about what you do. And we spoke to a lot of others on the phone, and we took up a lot of your time. I hope in the end it will be worth it. So thank you all again for all of your support throughout this effort. So what is the big idea that comes out of all of this? And I have to say, to start with, our team's experience was largely in the international sector. Each of us had at least 15 years working in microfinance internationally, almost globally. And I had the privilege of starting what today is de facto the Global Secretariat for Microfinance, CGAP. And at the time, I had donors provide us almost $50 million in funding over the 5 years I ran the program. And so we were able to fund more than 50 institutions, plus good practice, best knowledge development, and networks around the world in microfinance. So some of these ideas are going to come from that experience. And I know a lot of you will say, well, it's not comparable. I would suggest, if you haven't seen it, look at the report we did in 2012 on the U.S. sector with lessons from international, because we understand it's very different, but there are ideas that bridge across. So let me get to the specifics. First, we believe there's an absolute need to scale up and to achieve sustainability for many institutions in the sector. I fully accept that many of you may want to stay regional and small and continue high touch throughout and maybe not adapt or adopt technology. And that's perfectly fine, but that's not a solution for the industry at large. And that's also not a solution to meet the demand of so many people today who are in niche communities, in poverty, in poor communities, Latino communities, African American communities, communities that are just not easily getting access to credit. So while you can make your own individual decision, our look was at the sector level, if you will. Second, our fundamental recommendation is that over the next 5 years, we think there needs to be a dramatic expansion in access to credit from the CDFI sector, and we'd like to see 30 investable institutions created. And by investable, we mean that they're sustainable, they've reached scale, and that an outside investor without subsidy would be willing to look and fund them. I think that the low interest environment we're in is very misleading. I think that will change over the next few years, and we're going to see much more real rates of interest, higher rates of interest. Moreover, there's a limit to subsidy. We've talked about subsidy a lot. Our 2012 report has a major blue box that talks about the issue of subsidy, but you can only grow this sector so much on subsidy because there's only going to be so much available. So it's the delimiting factor unless you get by subsidy and become sustainable. So we're suggesting that the CDFI fund, in fact, create a niche fund, not change its practices per se, but create, because we don't want to go to Congress and we don't want to create new laws, but create a niche fund, a platinum fund that would fund starting with 15 or so institutions, rising to 30 over 5 years, fund institutions that have aspirations for growth and sustainability, and after 3 years that would be reviewed, and those not meeting goals would be dropped out of the program. It would not necessarily mean you would be ineligible for CDF5 funds, but you'd not be in the platinum program where you'd be funded year after year. We're also suggesting that there be a start in reaching out to private investment funds who would leverage up the capital from the CDFI fund. And I will tell you what the lesson was from International on that in a second. We also believe that you have to complement that with very good data on the industry and reporting, starting with ratings. There is a ratings institution, CARS, in the industry. It does a good job now. We suggested that anyone coming into the Platinum Fund be rated, and they report their data on a regular basis to the new CARS platform. And we're also suggesting that Treasury require the CDFI fund to report out, and if they wanted to use CARS as a reporting mechanism, by all means, but I don't think it should capture all this data and leave it captured in the system without transparency. We believe also that there should be capacity building in the sector, and Bob Christian spoke to a group of you on Monday. He will be on a panel, next panel, I guess. And Bob has run the Boulder microfinance program. It used to be in Boulder, Colorado, but due to limitations on visas, that program is now run out of Torino, Italy, and in Latin America. So there's a Spanish section, a French section, and an English section, and they provide capacity building for about 400 representatives of microfinance institutions from all over the world. And Bob is now a professor of experience at Syracuse University, and we like to create the incentive for him to start a U.S. Boulder, which could do a lot to build capacity, human capacity, because in order to scale, you need to build human resource capacity in the sector. And so we'd like to put different modules into play that could easily be done, not with a great deal of money, but with reasonable amounts of money. And so one of our goals is to get CRA lenders and foundations to pool, and the way we pool is get consensus around the strategy going forward. And so we would like to work with a number of your institutions after this conference to try to build a clear consensus of what would work. Finally, you need to bring the technical players. That's been discussed at length today, but in order to scale, in order to be efficient, lower your cost of operation, we'd like to try to bring the for-profits, technology players into this pool. And through Till Forward, you already have one effort. A number of you are working with others. There's Janie's platform. So there's lots to start, but you really need to do this sort of with a number of institutions. And we think our virtual network would be the one of 30 institutions would be a great start for doing this, starting with 10, 15 institutions. And finally, we'd like to say that if you had a virtual network, you could solve one of your greatest problems, and that is finding people because you could brand it, you could promote it, you could advertise it, and you could get it the seal of approval of institutions that have really are achieving scale and sustainability. And that, of course, would be very appealing to the banks and on referrals and to investors. So one last word about the international experience. I started the CGAP Secretariat in 1995. If anyone knew anything about microfinance, they knew about Grameen. If they were insiders, they knew about Grameen, Bank Rakyat Indonesia, and Banco Sol in Bolivia. By 10 years later, maybe 15 years later, there are 200 investable institutions. Many of them have transformed to become commercial microfinance banks. Interest rates have come down uniformly across the sector. Starting with one investment fund in 1995, there are now 100 investment funds servicing the sector worldwide, of which 30 are equity funds and 70 are debt funds. And there are families of funds within that doing debt and equity, some handling about $1 billion in assets. Now, that's very small by commercial scale funds, but they've brought close to $12 billion to the sector over the last 10 years. And I don't know what scale could be achieved here because there's lots of competition of credit cards, banks, community banks. But if we were to include the CDFI institutions, which would include community banks, would include credit unions, and yourselves, we think there could be substantial scale to the program. And as a final last word to this, we think it's very important to include the BDS providers, the TA providers, in a parallel program so that they would link with this virtual network. And we think over time it might make sense. It might make sense. We're not pushing this idea as an absolute for the CDFIs who are funders, the funds, to give up mentoring and TA provision and link with appropriate BDS providers. And so we'd like to see a parallel development program for those institutions working with Treasury, CRA providers, and foundations to have a uniform funding program for those institutions as well. Thank you. I'll stop there.
Thank you, Ira, and thank you personally and from AEO for the work that you've done and for the terrific team that